Thanks for coming. My name is Zhang. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Electrical Engineering. Today is my great honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Amory Lovins. He's going to give a special guest lecture for my course, E80J and 180J. So basically, this course is about renewable energy sources, energy storage, and smart power grids. So let me quickly go through Dr. Lovins' bio. So physicist Amory Lovins, he's a co-founder and chief scientist of Rocky Mountain Institute. He is an energy advisor to major firms and governments in 65 plus countries for more than 40 years. He is an author of 31 books and more than 600 papers. He received the Blue Planet, Volvo, Zayat, Onassis, Nissan, Schindler, and Mitchell Prizes, MacArthur and Eisenhower fellowships, 12 honorary doctorates, the Heinz, Lindbergh, Right Livelihood, National Design, and the World Technology Awards. He is the Office Cross of the Order of Merit, awarded by the President of Germany. Dr. Lovins is an honorary US architect and Swedish engineering academician. He has taught at 10 universities, most recently with Stanford's Engineering School and the Naval Postgraduate School. So he is the member of the US National Petroleum Council and a member of the Chief of Naval Operations Advisory Board. Time has named him as one of the world's 100 most influential people. Foreign Policy named him one of the 100 top global thinkers. Having said that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Lovins.
Electricity is 19% of the world's delivered energy, but nearly 2/3 of global electricity is made by burning about 2/5 of the world's fossil fuels to turn steam or gas turbines. Now, saving electricity saves about 3 times as much fuel, mainly coal, as saving direct fuel. So saving electricity has huge carbon leverage. And saving electricity also leverages huge dollar savings because electricity is a high quality, special, very capital intensive, very costly form of energy. Each cent per kilowatt hour is equivalent in the heat it contains to oil at $17 a barrel. So on that heat contained basis, our retail electricity in this country averages about 3 times as costly as crude oil. Of course, that's not refined products, and electricity can be used more efficiently than fuel, much more in transportation. But because electricity is convenient and controllable and clean at the point of use, we actually end up using more of it than we should. More than 1/5 of the electricity that Americans use delivers low temperature heat that cannot justify its cost. 40 years ago, I called this cutting butter with a chainsaw, and it doesn't make any more sense now than it did then. Now, the modern energy revolution is as much about renewable and distributed electric supply as about efficient use. So I'm going to focus here on renewables, and then in my public lecture at 5:20 this afternoon in this room, right after this slot, I'm going to say more about efficiency and its integration with renewable supply. We're used to seeing this icon for electricity, transmission towers and wires marching across the landscape, and they symbolize the world's most complex pre-digital machine. $30 trillion in replacement cost, $13 trillion in net book value. Slightly over half of that is for generators, a little under half is for the grid. But the electricity future may not be like this ubiquitous past at all, because efficient use and diverse, dispersed, renewable supply are starting to flip the whole sector on its head. Traditionally, utilities built giant coal and sometimes nuclear plants, augmented them with big gas plants. They bought a little efficiency in renewables, and those utilities were rewarded in general for selling more electricity, so they did. But now, especially in the 16 states where regulators instead reward cutting customers' bills, the market is shifting massively toward efficiency, renewables, cogeneration of electricity and useful heat, and ways to blend them all together reliably with little or no bulk electricity storage. So the whole system is turning other way up. Our 2011 business and design book, Reinventing Fire, which I'll say more about in my public talk, detailed how by 2050, at a historically reasonable pace, very profitable tripled or quadrupled efficiency in buildings, which use 3/4 of our electricity, and doubled efficiency in industry could shrink electricity use by 1/4 despite all-electric autos and a 2.6-fold bigger GDP. So that's a quadrupling of how much work we get out of each unit of electricity. And that would cost the provider less than a cent per kilowatt hour in today's dollars. That's 1/10 as much as we pay for electricity on average. Now, conservatively, this graph showing how we construct that saving does not include savings from integrative design, which I'll talk about at 520, and which can often make very large energy savings cost less than small ones. So we get expanding returns when we invest more in efficiency. And thus, America's electricity use, instead of growing 1% a year as officially forecast, could shrink 1% a year despite electrified autos. It's too early to tell for sure, but the actual decline in orange looks pretty close so far to that trajectory. And in fact, in the US, for reasons explained a year ago in my Forbes article, we're still saving fuels twice as fast as we're saving electricity. But in the past decade, absolute electricity use drifted down 2% while the economy grew 15%. And that decoupling has been gathering force for 24 years, as shown by these benchmarks. I think it'll continue to accelerate, and the industry is grudgingly starting to accept that stagnant or falling demand is the new normal. Here are the national data. The blue curve and its regression line show the slow downward trend in the annual growth rate of GDP. Red shows the accelerating annual rates of decline in absolute electricity consumption. Green shows the slope of annual rates of decline in electricity used per dollar of GDP. It's called electric intensity, which last year fell by a record 4.3%. And these trends squeeze electricity suppliers between falling revenue and often rising cost. In fact, the electricity transformation is about a lot more than demand. Powerful disruptors are converging on the electricity industry from at least 8 directions. And these 8 Pac-Men of the apocalypse move fast. They don't just add, they exponentiate. They're not lone wolves, they hunt in packs. They can gobble half of utility revenues in the 2020s. And together they're creating an alien competitive landscape faster than most utility cultures can cope. 3 years ago, all central power plants were called dinosaurs, and the full quote was, "Too big, too inflexible, not even relevant for backup power in the long run." Who do you suppose said that? Was it Greenpeace? No, it was actually Union Bank of Switzerland. And now there's a new wave of Pac-Men coming over the horizon. Let me give you 4 examples. There are more like low-voltage DC buildings. Super cheap batteries, like the solid-state polymer electrolyte alkaline rechargeable battery from Ionic Materials, may soon make distributed storage, including electric vehicles, so cheap that making your rooftop solar power 24/7 could add less than a cent, probably more like a half cent per kilowatt hour to your price of electricity, and that could strand the whole grid like utility telco copper. Then blockchain technology, which one of our subsidiaries is the leading energy developer of the technology. That's redesigning the rules of the game, starting with utility billing, certificates of origin, demand response, transactive energy. It can make markets clear and grid balance from the bottom up, not from the top down. So we have this global consortium of 52 companies that opened app writing last November, and we're already testing the first killer app. Wasteful reactive power, both shape and phase, could be eliminated system-wide by very fast and efficient real-time compensators that could fit in a $120 layer that plugs in between your meter and the socket. And that can free up grid and generating capacity and cut energy losses and customer bills and emissions. And then IEEE has a 14-year-old standard called 1547. It's been in federal law for 13 years now. And it was just revised a month or two ago to let solar customers automatically island, that is, isolate from the grid in a power failure, and keep running right through the grid outage, sustaining their service while protecting line workers. Customers may increasingly insist on that kind of resilience, and regulators ought to make it the default design. That's how our house works. So we're all on this magical mystery tour to an unknown land, but the general parameters are clear. Electricity is shifting from centralized, supply-focused, fossil and uranium-fueled, brittle, and analog to distributed, customer-focused, renewable, resilient, and digital. Completely different. And the deepest change, the hardest change to foresee, is how the information age informs and enables and organizes customers to take power into their own hands, saving, time-shifting, producing, and selling electricity. Now, the best part of this revolution is renewable power and the do-it-yourself generation that it permits. And at a utility scale, the market prices of modern renewables in this country are very granular but very rapidly falling, and their average cost often beats the price of fossil-fueled and nuclear-fueled power, even just counting operating costs. Berkeley Lab puts out an authoritative project-by-project database, and last summer, the last version, it looks like this for solar and wind power. Each photovoltaic or wind power project is a circle whose diameter is proportional to the capacity. And you can see there's a lot of variation between projects and between regions, but generally the prices are coming down. The black lines on the right-hand graph show most wind projects now beat new combined cycle gas plants. And in the Midwest wind belt, they do so by about a factor 2. A lot of these wholesale prices are below $30 a megawatt hour. Divide by 10 if you want cents per kilowatt hour, so that's 3 cents. And only $20 or 2 cents a kilowatt hour for wind power. Of course, these renewable prices are levelized. That evens out escalation or other changes over the life of the contract. But that a flat nominal price, which is the way 2/3 of the contracts are written, means a declining real price as shown on the left. And meanwhile, the natural gas prices to combined cycle turbines are officially forecast to go up, which would make renewables even more competitive. And the gas prices are volatile, incurring a financial risk that's worth about as much as the gas. That doubles the effective cost of the gas, although most market actors foolishly ignore that risk. Methane emissions, an existential threat to the gas industry, are valued here at 0, but they create also big financial and market risks and climate risks. Here's how solar prices in gold and wind power prices in blue compared with the green shaded areas of wholesale power price, nationwide in light green and the Midwest wind belt in dark green. Pretty busy graph, but again, you can see how renewables are beating the market. My CEO last year, by the way, showed data like this to a room full of gas executives who refused to believe these were real data. Too bad for them. Here's the same graph with the black lines, which this time represent not the entire cost of new gas-fired power plant, but just the cost of the gas fed into it. So that's the operating cost minus the maintenance and operators in the control room sort of component. So this is if the plant and its operation and maintenance were free, and it still beats gas. So you can see that the gas story is not looking pretty at all. Renewables also keep getting better and cheaper. The U.S. wind resource just rose by 2/3 in 7 years, not because the wind was blowing any harder, but because the towers got taller. Remember that the power you can extract from the wind rises as the cube of the wind speed. It's like a car's aerodynamic drag inside out. And by the way, the rotors are also being designed to work better in sites with weaker winds. So wind power is now cost effective in every state of the United States and also, by the way, of Germany. My colleagues have analogous whole system innovations for photovoltaics that can get 1 megawatt or half megawatt community scale distribution connected solar ground mount arrays down to about 2 cents a kilowatt hour unsubsidized in the next 5 years. Our industrial partners are tooling up to make this stuff now. And that means that we just cut the solar system costs in the last of 4 rounds of system redesign by twice as much as the new solar import tariffs may temporarily raise those costs. So this is getting to be quite an adventure. We thought we were doing well when we helped a New Mexico co-op use similar techniques to cut its cost to 4.5 cents. Now we just found another factor too by industrializing the whole installation business so that 2x8 arrays of modules slide off the truck, roll on, roll off, right onto the rack, snap in place, and you're done. And there are already over 100 megawatts of such projects planned or being built because these distribution-connected projects require no transmission lines. They bypass that whole upper end of the grid. Now, if you look at the lower 48 states, you might think, as we're often told, that renewable capacity has to go in the sunniest and windiest places, even if they're far away. Put wind in the high plains and solar in the southwest desert, and that would require long transmission lines that are slow, hard, politically difficult, vulnerable to a rifle bullet. But a more local and regional approach can often avoid those lines. So this map shows wind resources in blue. The darker the blue, the windier it is. Major load centers are in red, lesser load centers are in yellow, and you know where the Southwest and Florida and so on, sunny places are. And we're often told that the upper Midwest and Northeastern states have to bring in wind power from the Dakotas and solar power from Arizona. But actually, look harder at, say, Lake Michigan. You'll see that the offshore wind in the Great Lakes and off the Northeast coast would suffice to run the upper Midwest and the Northeast. And short underwater cables cost a lot less than long transmission lines out to the Dakotas. Across this map, the solar radiation varies less than twofold between, say, Arizona and Vermont, and it's strong in a lot of places with big loads like Texas and Florida. So if you put that together with the new wind turbine models, taller, higher solidity rotors running better in low wind speed places, you find that you get about the same economics for medium quality renewables near the load as for best renewables far away requiring transmission. And that's if all technologies and sizes and sites are allowed to compete fairly. We're working towards that. Now, America's aging and dirty and insecure electricity system has to be replaced by 2050. It's just wearing out. It's obsolete in a lot of ways. And Reinventing Fire found in 2011 that whatever we replace that system with is going to cost about the same. Whether we buy more of what we've got now, or new nuclear and so-called clean coal, or centralized renewables, or distributed renewables. The present valued cost is essentially identical. But these 4 futures turn out to have profoundly different risks around national security: fuel, water, finance, technology, climate, and health. 7 kinds of risk. Distributed renewables best manage all of these risks, and they're the only way we know to eliminate the cascading blackout risk. And at today's prices, as opposed to what we found in 2011, which was more conservative, the distributed renewables now cost less than the other three choices. So cheaper and less risky makes that choice a no-brainer, and the capital markets agree. Now, reliably integrating modern renewables into the grid at scale requires rethinking how we run the grid. Traditionally, power plants were brought online and offline, cranked up and down, fine-tuned moment to moment to match demand on timescales from milliseconds to hours to days. And grid resources were planned on a timescale of years or even decades. Now, climate protection also requires thinking at least a century ahead. But the basic paradigm of the last 129 years has been to match supply to load. And big thermal plants, traditionally called baseload, although that term's now useless because it has at least a half dozen different meanings, would run as steadily as they could, and then more flexible plants would adjust their output to trim to the fluctuating demand. Now it's different. Now both demand and fueled supply, aided by the information revolution, can and do follow the virtually costless supply from varying solar and wind power. Some policymakers still don't understand that modern grids don't run on base load but on base cost. Best buys first, which means renewables, which cost essentially nothing to run. So, with apologies for using 6 slides here that you'll see again in my public talk at 5:20, we are still told that only coal and gas and nuclear plants can keep the lights on because they're 24/7, while wind and solar are variable and thus supposedly unreliable. Well, here's why that's wrong. Variable, first of all, does not mean unpredictable. Here's how accurately the French grid operator in one stormy winter month forecast a day ahead the actual output of the country's wind farms. I'll bet they wish they could forecast demand that accurately. And then, secondly, the reason we built the grid is that no generator is 24/7. They all break. Giant plants fail too, about 10 or 12% of the time. And they lose then about 1 billion watts in milliseconds, often abruptly, often for weeks or months. And grids were designed to manage this intermittence by backing up failed plants with working plants. But in exactly the same way, and often at lower cost, grids can manage the forecastable variation of solar and wind power by backing up those variable resources with a portfolio of other renewables, all forecasted, integrated, and diversified by type and by location. So in Texas, whose grid has no big hydro dams and is not connected to the rest of the country, a 2050 summer week's expected loads can get a lot smaller and less peaky with efficient use. Then we can make 86% of the annual electricity with wind and photovoltaics. You can see they really are variable. Those are real data. And then we can make the other 14% from dispatchable renewables you can have whenever you want. That would be geothermal, solar thermal electric with heat storage so they can run into or through the night, small hydro, burning agricultural and municipal and industrial wastes, burning feedlot biogas in existing gas turbines, burning obsolete energy studies, that's my favorite. So now we've got 100% renewable supply, but you can see it doesn't very well match the load. So we can put the surplus into 2 kinds of distributed storage that are worth buying anyway: ice storage air conditioning and smart charging of electric autos. Fully build those out by 2050 and then recover their stored distributed energy when needed and fill the last gaps with unobtrusively flexible demand. So then we're all renewable every hour of the year. Only about 5% of the renewable output is left over to be spilled or made into hydrogen. So at the actual market prices I showed you earlier, let alone lower future prices, the economics should be really juicy. Some grid operators do that kind of choreography today in economies much larger than, say, the big island of Hawaii, which is 57% renewable powered. Germany and Italy and Britain are about 1/3 renewably powered, Ireland and France about 1/5. But there are 4 other European countries not rich in hydro that already make about half their electricity or more from renewables, adding no bulk storage and with superior reliability. In fact, for Denmark and Germany, 10 times as good as ours. In 2015, the ultra-reliable former East German utility got 49% of its electricity from renewables, and 3/4 of those were variable PVs and wind. And their CEO said he could get 60 or 70% from variable renewables without adding bulk storage. So these grid operators have figured out, with time and experience and learning, as Clay Stranger says, how to run the grids the way a conductor leads a symphony orchestra. No instrument plays all the time, but the ensemble continuously makes beautiful music. Of course, every kind of electric generator fails, but for different reasons and with different lumpiness and predictability and duration and consequences. Actually, about 98 or 99% of U.S. power failures originate in the grid. So no kind of centralized power plant can be resilient, no matter what technology it uses, because it's dependent on by far the most vulnerable, brittle part of the system. But if properly connected, distributed resources near the customer can be highly resilient. So to keep the grid reliable while we make it renewable, we have not just one grid flexibility resource, bulk storage, which I showed in magenta, but about 10 of them, which I've sketched here conceptually in order of increasing cost. Now, your actual costs will vary, but bulk storage comes last, not first, in economic priority. So we needn't wait for a storage miracle, and the market isn't waiting. Now, to be sure, behind-the-meter batteries have more benefits than just storing energy, and they can be cost-effective today in many circumstances. But cost-effective does not mean competitive. It only means that benefits exceed costs. It doesn't mean it's the cheapest way to get similar benefits. So as you see, there's a lot of such competitors, and they too are rapidly improving, so it's quite a crowded horse race. If you go to a battery conference, you'll hear everyone saying, my battery's better than your battery, and you'll hear almost nobody asking, what must any kind of battery compete with? There's a lot of other ways to do the same thing. So I'll show you shortly how unexpectedly big the demand response item up there is. So is diversification, which is shown. For example, if you look at each of the 3 power pools from Texas to the Canadian border and put wind farms in anti-correlated sites, that means if the wind's blowing here, it probably isn't blowing here, that can give you the same firm output with less than half the wind capacity. The developers didn't do that. They left half their money on the table, although you can do it after the fact with synthetic contracts, and some have started to. So again, looking at this range of options for grid flexibility to reliably integrate variable renewables into the grid, you see that bulk storage is neither necessary nor sufficient. Of course, in a modern renewable-dominated grid, there are more moving parts, there's more variation in output, you have to think harder, you really have to pay attention and have good forecasting tools. But with proper attention, the variable and flexible resources can reliably serve loads, steady or otherwise, not in the traditional way of giant thermal stations, but with newer resources that meet even better the classical criterion for so-called baseload plants. That is, they're the ones with the lowest operating cost, so you dispatch them whenever they're available. Understand, modern grids do not connect a single generator to a single load. So the reliability statistics of a single plant are quite irrelevant. Instead, all generators serve the grid. The grid serves all loads. So you're interested in the statistics of the whole ensemble of generators, just like in the symphony orchestra. Unless you're on a small desert island, you don't generally need storage, and whether a specific generator is working at a specific time doesn't much matter. What matters is the statistical reliability of the whole fleet of generators and the lines connecting them. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. I mentioned earlier that baseload means a half dozen things, and modern fora on electricity policy typically recommend that the term be abandoned. It's very confusing, it's ambiguous, it's no longer useful. And retiring the people who think the lights will go out if markets are allowed to work and retire obsolete and uneconomic thermal plants may take a while because, as usual, the incumbents are fiercely defending their obsolete assets against competition. But actually, if you look at the data, say in Europe, you find that building more renewables is making Germany's electric service more reliable, not less, as in these data. The white curve shows a common metric for outages, which fell by nearly half while the renewable output soared. And similarly in Texas, installed wind power in red tripled in 6 years. The reserves needed to cover wind shortfalls in blue fell by about half. And in fact, their Texas data, they have a public power pool that's very transparent in data. They unbundle and price every service. The data suggests that big thermal plants may cost 2 or 3 times more to integrate into the grid than wind farms do to achieve the same reliability. That's partly because big thermal plants, which are down about 6 to 12% of the time, fail suddenly in big chunks, while portfolios of variable renewables fail more gradually, gracefully, briefly, and predictably. Oddly, there seems to be no published analysis of such comparisons because the integration costs of big thermal stations were traditionally socialized as inevitable system costs. Nobody bothered to measure them. While the integration cost of variable renewables are often charged to the developers. They could be treated the same way because reliability is a system attribute, not a plant attribute, and shouldn't be ascribed or charged to specific projects or technologies. But what we know for sure is that integration costs are low for variable renewables. They're lower for dispatchable renewables, which are the other half of the world's renewable output, excluding big hydro. And they're probably zero for efficient use and demand response, but they're probably rather high for big thermal plants. Confirming this, there's a bunch of both European and North American utility studies showing that integration or balancing costs for variable renewables are low. They're generally well below a cent per kilowatt hour, even if wind power totals tens of percent of generation, as these utility studies show. The funny thing is we're charging many renewables for integration costs. We're not charging big thermal plants for integration costs that are probably bigger. That's an asymmetry that ought to be corrected. But what we also know from especially European experience is that high renewables futures, although they're readily affordable, will need wider and faster markets, new operating procedures, and careful operation, and a lot of patience with the learning. If you were to ask the Danish grid operators around, say, 2005, if they could become 60% renewable and keep the lights on, they'd have thought you were nuts. They said absolutely impossible. But now they do it routinely. Sometimes they're over 100%. One of the operators recently remarked, "I sure hope we never go back to the old system because that was so dull. Now we have to think about what we're doing." But they're good engineers. They keep the lights on. The National Renewable Energy Lab, using the best models available and with exhaustive peer review, has choreographed reliable up to 80 or 90% renewable electricity for the lower 48 states. And you can see the different instruments in Clay's orchestra going in and out here. Let's see. So the resource mix keeps changing in each day and between days, but the lights stay on fine. And here's how they model the evolution of, in this case, 60% renewable electricity from 2010 to 2050. They did model up to 90%, and that's now not a limit. So the black splotches, which are fossil and nuclear generation, diminish over the years, and the fluctuations you see here are not daily, they're seasonal. And that time scale, too, needs careful attention, but can be managed by diverse resources on supply and demand side. And if you had to, you could even make surplus renewable power into hydrogen and store it seasonally in old natural gas fields. Now, turning now to the demand side beyond merely efficient use, timely use, what we call flexawatts, to go with negawatts. flexible loads can take many forms. They're rapidly becoming available and attractive even to small and unsophisticated customers. And here's a fun little example. A typical Hawaiian household uses appliances at various times of the 24-hour day, and about half their load is under the yellow curve. That's while the rooftop photovoltaics are operating. So their utility tried and failed to prohibit solar hookups, and then wanted to allow them but to confiscate any leftover solar production without paying for it. And the customers are already rather angry at this point, so how would you expect them to react? Well, probably the same vendors who provide their PVs and batteries would offer them smart appliances that will scrunch 80 or 90% of their household loads conveniently into the solar hours, costing the utility nearly all its intended windfall and most of its ordinary revenue. So this anti-solar tariff, like all 6 we have studied, is a well-aimed boomerang that will actually speed and expand solar adoption by educating and annoying the customers so they leave the grid faster. Another way to think about this is photovoltaics on your roof plus efficiency plus this kind of demand response, load flexibility, gives you more market power than the utility has. And if you want to look at the speed of that kind of load defection, it depends on how much sun you have and your electricity prices. And those range in these 5 U.S. cities from Honolulu at the bottom to Louisville, the second down, Westchester County at the top. This is a bit of an eye chart. Don't peer at it too hard. I just want you to look broadly at the growth of the colored annual bars. The colored fraction shows for households on the left and commercial buildings on the right how much of the electric sales from 2014 to 50 could be done more cheaply by solar with on-site storage but no net metering than by buying from the grid. So you can see in different places and sectors how fast electric revenues go away. Ouch. And by the way, this is several years old. Now it's even worse. Now, if you next want to make the grid an optional convenience, just add electric vehicles. I'll get back to that. Now, another important value of flexawatts is to solve photovoltaics challenge that their strong midday generation fades at the end of the day just as folks get home and turn stuff on. So in these California low profiles, supply in the late afternoon, early evening has to ramp up steeply in what's called the duck curve. You all heard of the duck curve? Actually, in Texas, they call it the dead armadillo curve. So how can we manage this and other kinds of variability in solar and wind power? Well, with the 10 kinds of resources you already saw. Let's look more closely at just one of these 10 options, the second from the left, called demand response. That's the flexawatts part, where end-use devices respond intelligently to grid frequency or to radio internet signals to vary their operation and invisibly help the grid, flattening load shapes, even harnessing storage distributed in the thermal mass of buildings, but without inconveniencing the user. You don't even know this is going on. You know, if your air conditioner or water heater turned off for 15 minutes, you'd never know. But that kind of controlled operation has immense value to grid operators. So in the 2050 Texas grid, as shown here, the dead armadillo curve goes away if we combine electric vehicles, home plug loads, residential and commercial water heating, plus heating and cooling controls. And together, these can conveniently cut the 2050 summer load range each day nearly in half, save a quarter of the non-renewable capacity, make the renewable energy a third more valuable, and pay back in about 5 months. That's especially valuable in stressed parts of the grid. So in Brooklyn and Queens in New York City, Con Ed is deferring a $1 billion investment through third-party flexawatt solutions. And to see why flexawatts are a several-fold bigger resource than expected, you have to do hourly dispatch analysis. And you notice that the different kinds, those 8 categories I showed you, dispatch at different times to level net demand reliably, inconspicuously, and cost-effectively. Now, the traditional way to accommodate changes in load and wind or solar availability is to build gas plants, which can now be upwards of 60% efficient. And they provide electrical energy and peak capacity and ramping or flexibility capabilities. But well-designed portfolios of clean energy resources can do the same or better. Here on the West Coast, such a portfolio could replace a new combined cycle plant in this way, that renewables and efficiency provide even more low-cost energy than what the gas plant does, the red line. The peak needs are met with significant dollar savings from efficiency and demand flexibility instead of burning gas. And the storage efficiency and demand flexibility provide ramping capacity, including the extra that the photovoltaics need. That's the negative ramping shown at the bottom in yellow. Also, the smart inverters of clean generators can readily provide other needed services like voltage and frequency stability and short circuit duty, and they can do that faster and better and cheaper than gas plants can, as just spectacularly demonstrated in Australia by the new Tesla installation and also here in California. If you replace all the likely to retire thermal plants through 2030 with new gas-fired versions, you can lock in $0.7 trillion net present value of costs 0.3 gigatons a year of increased emissions. Bad stuff. But if you reinvest the savings in both large-scale and small-scale renewables and other distributed resources, you can cut both those liabilities by at least half, and your total cost goes down a lot. The central question in energy and much else, which wasn't asked till '76 and still is not asked very often, is what's the right size for the job? So in 2002, we wrote an encyclopedia called Small is Profitable, The Hidden Economic Benefits of Making Electrical Resources the Right Size. It's online, and it shows how the size of resources that make or save or shift or store electricity affects their cost and their value. The big thermal power plants stopped getting more efficient in the 1960s. They stopped getting bigger in the 70s, cheaper in the 80s, bought in the 90s. And instead, the risk-averse capital markets rushed to small, short lead time, modular, fast-learning, IT-enabled micropower that now outproduces global coal power. Renewables are now $1/3 $1 trillion annual investment. They have over half the global market for new capacity, and they're unlocking about 10 times greater value than we see immediately via the 207 kinds of distributed benefits described in that Small is Profitable book. The biggest value increases come from financial economics. That's often worth a factor 10 extra value for renewables, about half of that for non-renewables. There are big electrical engineering benefits, and there are miscellaneous effects adding up to another twofold or more, not counting externalities. And you can also get distributed benefits from efficiency and flexawatts. They're not limited to generation. And by the way, the same concepts apply about 2/3 to water and wastewater systems. There are a lot of areas of investment where we need to ask very carefully, what is the right size for the job? And the financial economics benefits come from minimizing regret at what you did you wish you hadn't, or what you didn't do you wished you had. So smaller and faster investments reduce financial risk from imperfect foresight, from lumpy instead of granular capacity. So it's actually worth paying nearly 3 times more per kilowatt for a 10 kilowatt resource you can build overnight than for a 50 megawatt resource you can build in 2 years. But actually, the small fast resource nowadays will typically cost less per kilowatt. Portable resources can be relocated to better locations, reducing risk and raising value. The ability to build as you need, pay as you go, cuts financial risk. Modular, fast-to-build technologies capture rapid learning, economies of mass production. You can get constant price long contracts for renewables and efficiency instead of adding risk worth as much as natural gas. because of volatile gas price. And a diversified supply portfolio should have a substantial chunk of financially riskless, that is, constant price renewables, even if they cost more, for the same reason that investors include riskless treasuries in financial portfolios even if they yield less. You get better overall returns that way, or for electricity, lower long-run expected prices. 5 long years ago, our consortium called ELAB of both incumbents and insurgents in the electricity business reviewed 15 studies trying to quantify the main benefits of distributed photovoltaics, and the results were very spotty and incomplete, but some of them found distributed benefits would justify photovoltaics at their then high cost without valuing their electricity at all, just looking at other distributed benefits. And conversely, today's cheap photovoltaics can often profit from energy sales without counting their distributed benefits. But either way, the uncounted money on the table can make moot a lot of common regulatory debates. Like, even if so many customers are buying solar that you start to worry about the small distributional effects of net metering, those will be smaller than the system benefits to customers. And ultimately, I think we'll end up with a bidirectional value tariff where customers and providers pay each other the fair market value of the services they exchange. Let me cover very quickly the notion of resilient design. We have a book online, 37 years old, for the Pentagon. It's still the definitive unclassified work on how to make big failures impossible by design instead of inevitable by design is now. And these principles are where the market will take us if allowed to. You're going to hear a lot more discussion of resilience, and everybody likes to say that their solution is resilient. I think it's a matter of system architecture, and these are the principles that ought to apply. It's not just about choosing one or another kind of power station. It's about how the pieces are all connected. We are going to see, in a time of more and fiercer storms, greater terrorism, asymmetric and hybrid warfare, a lot more value put on resilience. And we've already had experience of this, of course, in blackouts in this country and even bigger ones abroad. And these things can be caused by a bad solar storm, electromagnetic pulse attack, cyber attack. Those events could put this country back in the 7th century, more or less permanently. You know, when I wake up in the morning, if I'm away from home and the lights are still on, I'm surprised. I'm not surprised if I'm at home because Judy and I have arranged our solar system to work with or without the grid. That is the Pentagon's design principle for military bases, and yet the surrounding communities where their people live, and most Americans, are not allowed to use the same approach, the same automatic islanding to protect their houses. So, you know, Superstorm Sandy blacked out over 2 million New Jersey households for days. They had 1 gigawatt of solar on the roofs. They were number 2 after California. And nearly all those solar rigs survived the storm, but they'd all been wired not to work without the grid. Is that stupid or what? So now the utilities are starting to realize they need to change the rules. Another thing we ought to do is put solar and batteries into gas stations and untangle their wiring so we can pump gas and diesel fuel for first responders and gensets even if the grid is down, like after an earthquake or a fire. That seems a pretty simple thing to do. And by the way, every kind of electricity generation can fail catastrophically. It's not just the grid that's vulnerable. This little blue stalk growing out of the Powder River Basin shows the enormous concentration of coal traffic depending on one rail corridor that has had serious derailments and stuff before. And power plants and their fuel supplies are also weather sensitive. We've had cold snaps and storms shut down a lot of coal plants in particular. You get frozen coal piles, burst pipes, power plants that won't start. and climate change could make those kinds of extreme events more frequent. Nuclear plants also have some unique kinds of vulnerabilities I won't go into in detail here. When they run quite reliably, averaging 92% of their full-time, full-power output lately. But of course, 62% of the ones originally ordered were canceled before startup or prematurely closed later. More are slated for closure. 14% have had a forced outage of a year or more, 10 of them twice. Only 11% have escaped such long outages and remain economically viable in their regional grids. And they also have a unique problem that goes to reactor physics. In the Northeast blackout in 2003, we saw this. We had 9 U.S. reactors running perfectly at full output. They automatically shut down for safety when the grid failed, but then they took 12 days to regain full power, and in the first few days they produced practically nothing because some fission products, isotopes of xenon and samarium, were neutron sponges, and until those isotopes decay, they soak up the reactivity you need to restart the reactor and run it stably. So this is a kind of anti-peaker attribute of nuclear plants. They're guaranteed unavailable when you most need them. Renewables don't have any attribute like that. I think I'll stop here. If people want to talk more about nuclear, I can. It's a fairly dull subject. The main thing you need to know about it, you can find out by Googling Lovins Forbes Diablo, where I had a blog about a month or a year ago, well, less, on the deal to close the Diablo Canyon nuclear plants in San Luis Obispo, and how that would, as PG&E agreed, save money and save carbon. The reason is that the distressed nuclear plants, the ones that can't compete just on operating cost anymore, are so expensive to run that if you close them and respend the saved operating cost on efficient use of electricity instead, you'll save 2 or 3 times as much carbon. So we need to track not just the carbon but also the dollars, and if you do that, you discover that even though those are important carbon-free resources, it's actually more climate effective not to run them and to take the money back, let alone avoided subsidy to keep them running, and instead buy efficiency with it. And if you want to know how this is going, I'll just leave this graph up for a while. That's on electric production by different sources, and you can see who's winning the race. Let me stop there and see what's on your minds. Did I say anything controversial?
Thank you for the great talk, Dr. Lovins. So I think we have plenty of time for Q&A, so please feel free. Can we get the mic for the audience who wants to ask questions? Or maybe I can take this off.
For a lot of people who are doing activism that connects energy production with climate change kind of stuff, look to divestment as a really good model. So when you say what's the right size for the job, I'm wondering, have the Rocky Mountain Institute looked at the idea of taking money that's been divested from fossil fuel and put it into distributed generation? And like, is that, like who or what is leading distribution, the idea of distribution systems in terms of solar or wind? That's something that local communities or smaller groups can create.
Well, it's a huge spectrum of investment activity. Some of it is by big utilities, public and private. A lot is by municipals and co-ops, which you can't invest in unless you're a member. And a lot is by private developers. So there's a huge span of potential asset classes and vehicles and very lively markets. There's also, of course, all the international market, which is growing enormously. The U.S. is slightly slowed down at the moment, not much, and still vibrant in many sectors and regions. but others like China are accelerating. To give you a little idea, China in 2013 installed as much photovoltaic capacity in that year as the U.S. had cumulatively installed in the previous 59 years. In 2016, China doubled the pace. They're doing 3 football fields an hour at that point, and they installed more. Well, they installed 11 gigawatts in June alone. Last year, China installed more PVs in June than we installed all year. We got some catching up to do. So there's plenty of market opportunity. A lot of the divested funds are from the oil business, some from coal. Coal industry is going down pretty fast. Oil will follow later. World peak oil demand will probably be in the 2020s and more likely the early than late 2020s. So oil companies are starting to get properly worried about this. And we're helping some of them figure out, are there attractive forward paths for them. I would urge you to put your money in these best buys: efficiency, demand response, renewables, and be prudent in your investments. But you don't need to invest in fossil or nuclear power anymore, or in utilities that don't get it. Encourage the others by putting your money where the intelligence is.
Yeah, thanks, Amory.
Jerry?
Something I've been wanting to pick your brain on. You probably know about something called Jevons paradox, whereby efficiency, nobody's going to argue against efficiency, except there are people who say that it's overrated because if you get more efficient energy systems, then people are going to use that savings and spend it, and thereby worsen the climate problem from economic overgrowth, et cetera.
So we ought to mandate inefficient devices and appliances so nobody will have that surplus income to spend, and we won't be at risk of spending it in dumb ways. Yeah. Okay. So
well, what do you make of Jevons paradox?
So this is called the rebound effect. It is real. It is extremely small. It's so small it's usually impossible to measure, except in small pathological cases. There's a large literature on it, some of which you'll find at rmi.org. But just think about it. Why the economic theory doesn't reflect your real experience. You don't get the price signal that you get when you gas up your car from your electric use. You get a bill in arrears that isn't itemized. It's just total number of kilowatt hours, and you pay it a month later. So you can't tell what you saved or how you saved it. It's as if you went out of the supermarket with a cart full of various foods and went home and ate it, and a month later they sent you a bill with one number, and you have no way of telling that tuna was expensive and kale was a bargain. Also, there are saturations. If you get a more efficient refrigerator, the claim is that you will waste more electricity by running it more. You don't run it more. You don't want the milk to freeze. You don't wash clothes that are already clean. You don't heat or cool your house to the point where you get uncomfortable or sick. Now, it is quite true that you will save money by saving energy. That's one of the great virtues of it. So if you were really dumb, you could spend the money on heliskiing or buying outdoor space heaters and space heating outer space. On the other hand, if you knew how you saved the money because you did invest in the more efficient device or use it more mindfully, guess what? You can invest in more of the same. You could use it to buy better local organic food or get a bicycle or e-bike or a lot of other smart things you could do to save energy and resources all around you. So the rebound actually can run backwards. It's a matter of how well informed you are and what mindful choices you make.
Amory, we got a question here.
Hi. I've heard you talk several times, and it's always extremely convincing.
You haven't heard this one before. As a one-off.
And you talk about the market advantages both for consumers, and you talk about these companies who are beginning to think about these things. I wish that you would tell us a bit about the politics of getting this done, not just in the US and where we already have a grid, but in something like Puerto Rico. Several years ago, I went to Uganda, and I was really impressed by the fact that so many of these people in the villages that did not have electricity had very small panels bought from China that were enough to do their cell phones and for kids to do their homework and so forth. And when this, yes, very good, when this disaster happened to Puerto Rico and everybody is out of electricity, I wonder why there aren't solar companies that try to get contracts to solarize Puerto Rico when so many things are destroyed. Well, could you tell us a bit about it?
Well, yeah, like Eric Limpecker at MIT Lincoln Lab, and a bunch of other people that really know what they're doing in solar and solar microgrids did go to Puerto Rico and install a lot of good stuff, but they can't do it under or with federal help or under federal contracts because of something called the Stafford Act, which says that after a disaster you have to rebuild to the same specs as what was already there. In other words, you have to rebuild the same 50-year-old stuff, which is, again, really, really dumb. It's meant to avoid shoddy partial replacements and shortchanging people, but now it's having the opposite effect. So that needs to be changed. There has also been extremely difficult, fractious, and sometimes corrupt politics behind the rebuilding, like the original operation and the reason that the grid was in such terrible state to start with. It was rusting and falling apart. There was an excellent New York Times piece on this just in the last week or so. Yes, the technology exists and the economics are compelling for rebuilding something completely different than what was there. And remember, it was a grid problem. It wasn't a generating problem. They had plenty of capacity. They had fuel on hand, and they couldn't deliver it because the storm had knocked down the wires. So, of course, now under the Stafford Act, we have contractors rebuilding the wires on the same exposed ridge lines, and they're going to fall down in exactly the same way. They just aren't as rusty to start with. Actually, Rocky Mountain Institute has very active programs in the Caribbean, in about, I think, 5 island nations, helping them switch from diesel to efficiency of renewables. We have similar efforts underway for the past few years in Rwanda, Sierra Leone, Uganda, now Nigeria and Ethiopia. So those are collectively called the SEED program, SWED, and you'll find it at rmi.org. We have been rather active in Puerto Rico as well. The obstacles are formidable, but a lot of the smaller NGO private actors are making good progress despite all the challenges to the official large-scale programs. Ma'am?
Hi, Amory. Thanks for your work. You didn't specifically talk about collective community choice energy, which is kind of a movement that's spreading very rapidly in California, and right here in our 3-county area, it's going to be in effect in July. And I wondered if there might be other people in the program, in the audience, who might want to know a little more about that, and also what your role might be in any of that.
We're not directly involved in it. Others who want to know details can ask you about it afterwards. Sounds like you're very knowledgeable. But it is a way for communities to decide to make their own power supply arrangements. There are very robust and vibrant markets for getting power often cheaper than you can under present utility arrangements. as you can imagine, companies like PG&E are not very enthusiastic about this, and it means that they are uncertain to many, many thousands of megawatts 5 years out how much load they're going to have because they don't know how many customers they're going to have. Well, welcome to the competitive world of disintermediation and the 8 or 12 Pac-Men of the apocalypse that I mentioned earlier. PG&E is, a company I've worked with for a long time, and we've had a lot of interesting conversations about this. I don't think they should be protected from those competitive forces as they have tried to arrange. We have the same thing going on in Colorado, where Boulder, for example, is trying to municipalize their utility assets. And of course, there will be huge court battles about what are the assets worth, fair market value or their depreciated net book value, which is probably what the law says. So yeah, this fight's going on all over the world as people take power into their own hands. And if you feel your utility has done a good job and you want to stick with them, do that. If you feel that you have knowledgeable and trustworthy local folks who can do a better job, you can try that. But you are no longer limited to just one thing. You have choice. And I think that's a very powerful driver for accelerating the kinds of changes I've described on both the supply and demand side.
Hi. As an aspiring physicist and engineer myself, one source of energy that has particularly interested me is nuclear fusion power. And based on what I know of it, it seems like with advances in material science and particle physics, it seems like it's becoming a more viable energy source. So I just wanted to see what you know about it and like what your thoughts on are it.
Well, unless somebody comes up with fundamentally new physics, which I would not exclude, I don't think it's promising to try to do fusion on Earth. It would be the most difficult engineering we had ever done, at least by any currently proposed method, and it's fundamentally uneconomic. Why do I say that? Well, because it would be quite wrong to try to compete with existing coal and nuclear plants because they are way too expensive, they're obsolete. That's the wrong bogey. What you have to beat, unsubsidized, is currently 3-cent renewable power heading for 2 and quite possibly for 1. So the fusion advocates who say they can get 8 or 10 cent a kilowatt hour power from some theoretical machine very far from commercial reality, I think are whistling in the wind. They're several fold out of the money. Let me show you the version of this argument that really is formulated here for fission for small modular reactors, but it applies equally well to fusion. It really takes magical thinking to think that either of these technologies can compete against efficiency and renewables. The small modular reactors would initially produce electricity, say their advocates, at about twice the cost of today's reactors. That's because as a matter of physics, reactors don't scale down very well. But today's reactors make electricity at least 3 to 6 times costlier than modern renewables, or 5 or 10 times more than on-site efficiency, which you notice is already delivered, and the delivery costs another 4-odd cents average per kilowatt hour. But by the time small modular reactors, if successful, could begin mass production, their carbon-free rivals are going to get another 2-fold cheaper based on observed learning curves, which no nuclear technology has demonstrated. So do the math. 2 times 3 to 6 times 2 means mass production would have to make small modular reactors about 12 to 24 times cheaper. Good luck with that. I don't see any plausible way you can imagine that. In other words, small modular reactors are decades behind small modular renewables, which do scale down well. So nuclear can never catch up. And there's no novel design or fuel cycle that can escape this trap. But the same is true of fusion as we now know it. That is, if the nuclear one-third of the prohibitive capital cost of today's fission reactors were free, you're still stuck with the other 2/3, which is the boiler, the steam turbine, the generator, the switch yard, the heat sink, the control system. I think the same would be true of a tokamak or other such fusion reactor. But the non-nuclear 2/3 are still out of the money by 2 to 6-fold. So to make fusion work on Earth as a practical power source, you have to think of something completely different that isn't a steam cycle. It would make electricity directly. Maybe there's a way to do that. I don't think it's been seriously proposed yet. I don't want to exclude wild innovations. It may be possible, for example, to use acoustic cavitation or some other exotic technique to make cheap hydrogen without electrolysis, without chemistry, just with physics. Physics beats chemistry. And we may see something like that, in which case everything I've just told you could get a lot easier and cheaper. And that could be very useful for decarbonizing the non-electric majority of the economy, not just the transport part with electric vehicles and such, which I'll talk about at 5:20, but also things like industrial process heat that are a much more interesting challenge. We have ways to do that, but cheap hydrogen could make it even better. So far, I don't think fusion is in the running, so as a recovering physicist, I find it fascinating physics, but I doubt it will be commercial. And the right way to do fusion with what we now know is appropriately sited, which is 150 million kilometers away. Very reliable, well-engineered, just harvest what it sends us. That's the sun, of course.
Other questions?
I see one back there.
Over there.
You know, there's a lot of alternatives. I haven't heard talk about fuel from plastic that you can economically, and what about fuel from hemp?
Was that hemp?
Hemp, yes.
Well, hemp is a remarkable fiber, and I'm happy to see a revival of that industry. Of course, our government used to subsidize and strongly encourage hemp production for fiber during the war. It's a very useful material and has a lot of other uses. The plastics are a few percent of the fossil fuel throughput of the country, and we probably shouldn't be making that much of them, and we should certainly be not just reducing, but reusing, remanufacturing, recycling. There are some very nice emergent and some commercial techniques for completely recovering and reusing plastics, but that would mean closing loops rather than just pushing more molecules through the system and sending them to landfill or dumping them in the ocean. I think the more we find out about where this stuff goes, the less happy we're going to be about it. So it's not a panacea, but plastic recovery as a material is very useful, and it's generally a better deal than burning the stuff. And you have to be rather careful how you burn it, depending on what kind it is. You don't want to make dioxins. You don't want to release other stuff. A colleague of mine was almost killed recently in India because somebody burned plastic at low temperature in the alley under his hotel window, and he got cyanide poisoning. And of course the hotel thought this is just fine because it's in a province or a state of India called Goa, where people routinely burn plastic to repel mosquitoes. Who knew?
Other questions? So there's a mic behind you.
Hi, I'm Michael. I'm an electrical engineer. My idea was to see if microgrid is a viable option for especially smaller communities. Do you feel that, like, if you incorporate solar, wind, and maybe have it power a pump that actually powers a hydroelectric, you think that would be more feasible than incorporating longer transmission lines in larger areas using just solar?
Well, they should all get to compete with each other, but generally, yes. The transmission lines are harder to build in this country than most, but they're not easy anywhere, and they're fairly expensive. They're vulnerable to a rifle bullet. Microgrids can instead be resilient. They can be distribution connected without needing the transmission. From our African field work as well as U.S., we're convinced that they are a very promising method of community power. Currently, in Africa, we can do microgrids with power at half the best cost or a quarter the average cost of existing solar microgrids. And the latest innovations in our Nigerian charrette some weeks ago suggest another factor of 2 scope for improvement. There are other scales that you need to look at carefully as well. This gizmo I took out of my pocket, called a Waka Waka, Swahili for shines brightly, sits on a Coke bottle, shines down on the table, and will run for 10 hours at this very high brightness, or 150 hours on low brightness on 1 day's charge on the solar side in the sun, or 2 days in the cloud, and you can finance it off the cell phone recharged from the USB port. There are a lot of devices like this. This is a particularly good one because there's no wires or connectors. It's all compact, very small form factor because of the high efficiency of the components. Now, this is to replace kerosene. There's about 1 billion people off-grid without light at night. So they burn kerosene, and that's about $38 billion a year for lamps that kill millions of people a year from their pollution in the house. And those lamps also, if they were a nation, would rank about 8th in carbon emissions. And people earning on average under $2 per household per day are spending, I believe it's a quarter, maybe it's a third of the total cost of global lighting to deliver very inefficiently 1,000th of the world's light. But if you have something like this, you could teach your daughter to read, and you'd have light to go outside at night so you don't step on a cobra and so on. A huge advance in human health, safety, and development, and it pays back in weeks to months against kerosene. Another interesting scale came up recently with a German outfit that was told, well, you have to have microgrids for productive use, like grinding grain, other village small industry. And the engineer said, so what's the toughest productive application? They said welding. You can't possibly do that without a microgrid. So in half a year, his engineers in Berlin had come up with a set of folding solar panels and power electronics that ride on the back of a scooter, and you just come into the village, unfold the stuff, plug it in, and start welding. And there's 10 of these now running around Tanzania. So I think there's a lot of different scales that compete in different ways, and we're just starting to figure out what is appropriate in what situation. We've run into African villages where it would be natural to extend the grid from the nearby big town to the village a few kilometers away, but there isn't any surplus generating capability in the big town and no capital to build the line, so they don't. So you have to do it in a more granular bottom-up way. There are situations where microgrid development is actually driven by the desire of the incumbent utility to keep control over everything. There are other places where microgrids come from the bottom up. So lots of different situations, but yes, it's a very important technology, and I'll end with one other thing about it. Ashok Jhunjhunwala, the most senior professor in the IIT system in India, is a double E at Chennai, and he just got the IEEE Global Award for direct DC string nanogrids, I suppose, where the photovoltaic string, the batteries, and the end-use devices are all 24 or 48 volts DC, no inverter. And he puts them in rural Rajasthan where there's no grid to connect to anyway. Why have an inverter? That's the most unreliable component over time. Capacitors die in time. So, and he's actually stood up a couple of industrial consortia to make low voltage DC very efficient appliances and use devices. And it turns out the little 1 or 2 watt conversion losses between DC and AC both ways throughout the conventional system waste about half the photovoltaic energy because the loads are so small in each device, it really adds up. So he's roughly doubling the efficiency and capital efficiency of the system by not needing power electronics, just by doing everything at low voltage DC. That's a very smart idea, and I think we're going to see more of it. So that's a different scale of microgrid, but very convincing results. Thanks.